Welcome to Religious Rejects, the podcast by religious rejects for religious rejects. Today, we are going to talk about heaven and hell. Dun, dun, dun. Do they exist? Are they real? Or is it just something that religious leaders use to manipulate and control people?
That's where my money is.
That's where your money is?
Yeah.
These are the questions we're going to consider today. I'm Alicia, she, her.
And I'm Christine.
We're glad you're here today. So let's get into it.
Yes.
So Christine, what did you grow up thinking about heaven and hell? I mean, I know you came to the church a little bit,
A little bit later.
A little bit later. You weren't born into it.
No.
What did you learn about heaven and hell?
I think it's interesting to note that because I kind of grew up in a non-religious family, my mother was an atheist, my dad just didn't go, I never really heard about it. But with that being said, there was this part of me as a little girl, and I remember this vividly, unfortunately, that I honestly thought, I started questioning what happens when you die, like at 5. So when I was little, my understanding or thoughts, there was no understanding. I was 5, but I really thought that when you died, you just kind of like were put in a box, put in the ground, but you still had all of your thinking capabilities. And so I would just, I would sit there in the middle of the night just thinking about forever. I'm just going to sit there in the ground and think forever. To this day, thinking about something lasting forever still brings a little bit of like fear in me. Eternity, forever, any of that, I just go, ugh. You know what I mean?
That would be scary, for sure.
So that, again, was that heaven? Was that hell? I hope it wasn't heaven, but that was, I had no good feelings or good ideas about what happened when I died.
Yeah, that sounds terrible.
So then, of course, later in life, then my family gets saved and I begin to learn about this idea of heaven. I was even in a little street evangelism kind of outreach thing and had to do this scene where I was walking the streets of heaven and the pearls and the streets of gold and all this stuff, and I really played it up. So then that became my idea of heaven. But I will be honest with you, that little bit of like, but you're gonna be there forever, still kind of came in, and it was like, it doesn't sound fun. No offense, but it didn't sound fun. Just to walk the streets of gold. Okay, then what?
Right.
Eventually it's going to get boring, right?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. So, that was my thing. But I was definitely scared of hell because I figured what I had learned as a child, or what I thought about as a child, must have been hell now that I knew what heaven was.
Oh, yeah.
So,
okay.
That's where I was.
Yeah. I remember wondering, what would happen to us when we died. My grandmother died when I was a freshman in high school. So then I wondered, was she able to see me? Where was she? Was she in the sky? You know what I mean? I had all these questions, and then it kind of worried me because then I was like, I don't want her to see some of the things that I'm doing. I know she would not approve of some of the things I'm doing.
Yeah. Did you have that thing that they could see you?
Yes.
So did I.
Yeah.
Like as if they were in a room watching a TV and I was on. Yeah, they were just watching my life. As if, and again, if that's heaven, that wouldn't be fun either. I wouldn't want to sit and watch somebody's life in a lazy boy and just
and just be like, oh nope, not a good choice, Alicia, not a good choice.
Like yelling at like a reality show. Don't do it.
Back it up, no more. It's gonna kill you. Yeah, it's not good. Yeah. And then I found a few years ago, I was going through some of my old boxes, and I found a paper that I wrote for an English class in 10th grade. In it, my whole argument was that if there is no heaven, then what's the point of life? That there's that life's only purpose is to be able to go to heaven, which kind of surprised me because I forgot that I thought that and believed that at one point. And it made me sad because if that's the only point of life, then what is, I mean, that just doesn't say much about life because it's all focused on the afterlife then, you know? And so
Yeah.
that was really kind of wild to realize that I used to believe that wholeheartedly.
And I think I've heard that before. Like now that you say it, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that because that was the moment you started questioning whether there was a heaven or hell, that is kind of like the first thing that comes back to you. Like, well, then why are we here?
Mhm.
As if like, well, duh. Like
Right. It's
you have
another,
this is the test
yeah,
to make it one way or the other.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is
It's another slippery slope.
another,
You know, another
I
slippery
know.
slope. Like
Mm,
if you start with one question, it's just going to take you to another, and you're
that's
down a
right.
slippery slope
I
to
know.
dancing, to gambling, to sin, to cards. You know,
Yeah.
and ultimately sex, right?
Which then all leads to hell.
Yeah, it all
Like,
leads to hell. Yeah. So yeah, so obviously for us, heaven and hell were very much a part of the Christian churches that we grew up in, that we
yes.
came from, and that were big motivators
Yes.
for behavior and how to act in this world and to make sure that we were going to heaven and not hell.
Right.
Yeah.
Hmm.
We wanted to kind of dive into this idea of heaven and hell and think through why is there this idea of heaven and hell. It's something that a lot of people really struggle with because you and I remember thinking when I was a kid, what about all the people who never knew Jesus or
Right.
they lived before Jesus lived? And so now they're all going to go to hell? That doesn't seem fair. That doesn't seem like a loving God. And what about all the people in parts of the world who,
Mhm.
the Christian missionaries haven't made it there yet? So
Yeah.
what are they going to do? They're going to spend their life in hell. And I know that that has inspired generations of missionaries to go out and do this, saving of people.
Mhm.
That's a whole other conversation about the kind of damage that that sort of mission work has done in various cultures around the world. However, how do we reconcile these ideas of a heaven and hell with a loving God? It's a tricky balance.
Right. It absolutely is. For most of us, just as people, we feel like we need to have this need for cosmic justice. This whole
Mm,
idea that, okay, I have been wrong. I mean, justice is huge. We see it everywhere. Even in today, people need justice for certain things before they can get closure. And so you've got this idea that people just crave that, and they're really hoping that their God will deliver the justice, if not here, then at least in the afterlife.
mm-hmm.
Um, which, you know, can I just say that the craving for justice really hammers the point home of why Jesus probably said, "Yeah, y'all aren't good judges, and you really shouldn't. You really shouldn't judge." Like it kind of makes you go, "Oh, okay, I see now."
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think I see why we're not supposed to judge because think about it, like if I had it my way, the people I'd be like, you're out, you out. You're on the line. I'm going to give you another week to figure something out. But you know what I mean? It really is kind of a scary situation. But because we have such a need, sometimes I wonder, did we create this concept of heaven and hell just so we feel better about, Hitler, let's just say. That's always the issue. Like, is Hitler going to be in heaven? Like, that's an issue.
Yeah,
Like, can you
right.
imagine?
It's almost like this idea of hell and seeking justice. It's like the cosmic John Wick movie, where it's like you go and you seek revenge on all the
Yes.
people who have
Yes.
wronged you and hurt you and all this kind of stuff, but it's not you that's doing it, it's God that's doing it in the
Right.
afterlife. And it's kind of a strange concept really when you think about it and who Jesus was when he was here on earth.
Right. Because Jesus didn't seem to do that,
No.
and we've talked about this, I'm sure. Um, you know, Jesus could have, when Judas sells him out, Jesus calls Judas a friend.
Yeah.
He doesn't say, he doesn't like shake his hand and say, "Woe to you." You know what I mean? He was like, "Do what you need to do, friend."
Yeah.
And yee, you know,
Right.
interesting.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons that people think that the idea of heaven and hell is a comfort, is that when you can't get justice in your lifetime, then it's like you've got, God on your side who's going to punish
Mhm.
people after life. It seems to me like more people that I know are more worried about whether they're going to actually end up in hell or not, and
Mhm.
that's like a big motivator, and like trying
Yes.
to save the people around them so that the people they love don't end up in hell after
Mhm.
they die and this sort of thing. And I know that people coming from these traditions where they really emphasize hellfire and brimstone, that is a very real concern and a very real worry for,
Mhm.
your family members. So the other piece that I think comes with this is it controls behavior of people in
Yes.
Christian churches. So it's like, you know, it's a way of, you can be part of the church if you adhere to these guidelines, if you
Mhm.
adhere to these ideas about what you wear, how you behave, whether you can dance or play cards,
Mhm.
and all those things that we've talked about before that people have seen as immoral or
Right.
unethical or whatever.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if you've seen that too, where it's like this motivation for behavior or kind of a form of control.
Oh, absolutely. I think I definitely was stuck in that part of it. I think for me, deconstructing the whole thing of just evangelicalism and all of that stuff, one of the pieces that really got me is like, okay, what is heaven?
Mm.
What is hell? What do we actually know? And see, and that's the hard part. We don't really know anything, because in
Right.
order to know,
Yes.
you got to go.
Yeah.
And we're still here.
Yeah.
So, you know,
It's all speculation.
it is all speculation. And so I had to sit there and just really kind of wrap my head around. And I think a lot of people do this idea of, love, love, love. Jesus is love. God is love, 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 love. Oh, but if you don't do it all right, then I don't really love you, and you're going over here for eternity. Eternity.
Yeah.
And again, that word just still just scares me.
Mm-hmm.
Like forever, I'm going to be separated from God, all because of this finite time here. I'm going to be forever here.
Yeah.
And that I think that just didn't sit right. And I
Yeah.
think again for me it's like, if it doesn't sound like love, if it doesn't sound like God, if it doesn't sound, you know, loving, and I know there's probably people out there going, "Oh, but God wants to, he is judge and blah 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 blah." Great, but it just doesn't feel right
Right.
that God would do that.
Mm-hmm. I
So,
agree. Of course, we can't talk about heaven and hell without saying the effect on the LGBTQ plus community.
right.
It is the great attempt at behavior modification within the LGBTQ plus community. Like, if you don't stop being gay or trans or whatever, then you are going to, and then I don't know if you ever had this, but like we weren't allowed to swear. So it was HE double hockey sticks. Yeah, I don't know if you ever heard that. No? Yeah,
I
did
have,
you hear
yeah.
that?
Mhm.
Because hell was a swear word. So
Right, right. It's not a place, it's a swear
HE
word.
double hockey sticks. And so that has been a huge issue for so many people who wonder, why would God make me
Yes.
this way? I can't change this about myself. Why am I made this way just to go to hell? And that's a really
Yeah.
big struggle for a lot of
It's a
folks. And
struggle and it's dangerous
it is.
because people then begin to think there is no point, there is no hope.
Yeah.
And then they cut their life short, unfortunately, because if they're already going to hell, then why stay here? They can't fix it, they can't change it, so let's just get out of it. And then they deprive, themselves and others, you know, of themselves, who
Yeah.
God made them,
Right.
you know? And I think again, it's like, wow, why when you stop and think about all of those things that we do that really contribute to people not being who God made them to be,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it's like, is that God then?
Yeah.
Isn't God's whole plan for us to come here and be who He's made us to be? So if everybody else is stopping that, you know, all these ideas, all these thoughts, all of this, all these manipulations, maybe they're not God.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's crazy talk. I know.
No, it's not crazy talk.
Yeah.
To me, it makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
And again, and that just comes back to that idea that I had when I was in high school, that what's going on in this life is not, it doesn't matter. It's like all about the afterlife. And so the people who are in that place of despair, it's just like, well, it doesn't matter because I'm already going to hell. So what's the point? And that's, yeah, again, that is not, to me, that does not point to a loving God
No.
at all.
Streaming from the heart of the Rockies, this is Religious Rejects. Watch, listen, and join the discussion at religiousrejects.com.
Let's dive into what the Bible has to say about heaven and hell.
For me, the one, if you were to say heaven, and again, I don't remember any specific scriptures about what heaven looks like. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about last time, salvation. You know what I mean? Like John 3:16. You know, if you do this, you know, then you will have eternal life. But what is eternal life? And again, that makes me scared because that's forever.
Yeah.
So now I'm like, well, do I want eternal life?
Right.
Like, I don't, okay. I think there's lots of people that want to believe that there's mansions in heaven.
Oh, yeah.
That God's gonna make that. So you have that John 14:2-3. In my Father's house are many rooms. I'm going there to prepare one for you. And this is what Jesus is saying in the Gospel of John. And then Philippians 3:20 says, our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await a Savior from there. Which, okay, again, that doesn't tell us like what heaven looks like.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I'm not even sure how we got to these streets of gold, and maybe I've missed something. I'm sure I have.
I think a big part of the streets of gold thing comes from Revelation.
Yeah.
That acid trip from
The acid
from John.
John's acid trip on the island. Yeah.
Yeah, where it's this apocalyptic vision, and yeah, there's so many debates about what it means, and there's all these very really vivid imagery about all kinds of stuff, kind of like Ezekiel. Ezekiel has a bunch of really vivid imagery too.
Yeah.
And so people who have active imaginations, I think, sort of get caught up in that, and that's going to be a discussion for another episode.
Yes. Very excited for
the
that.
next episode, which is on the rapture. Very excited about that. But I think some of that streets of gold, that sort of thing, comes from people reading the Revelation of John.
Yeah. And taking it literally.
Right.
And I think that's the key. Again, now we're going back to, how do you take the Bible? Are you going to read it literally, or are you not going to, you know what I mean? Or are you just going to understand that this is just a possibility, or what people thought, or an apocalyptic vision?
Yeah.
That,
well, and they didn't know that the earth was round. For example, they didn't know that the earth was round back in the day. That understanding of the earth came later. And they had this, this view of the world where it's surrounded by water. This is the ancient Hebrew understanding when you're thinking of the Hebrew Bible. It's surrounded by water. So, the heavens are above you, which is really just literally the sky. And the water falls through holes in the sky because you're surrounded by water. And because the water will sometimes come up out of the ground, and sometimes it'll come from the sky. And so it's a very different understanding of the world. And literally, sometimes the heavens is really just meaning the sky, because that was their cosmology. It was how they understood how the world functioned and how it was built. And that is not how we look at it at all now. We understand that there's an atmosphere and then there's space beyond that, and there's,
Yeah.
you know, planets and then galaxies and going on into the universe. There's a whole lot of stuff that we know today that they did not know and is very different. And so I think we read a lot of things into their understandings. We read into their words that have been translated as hell or heaven much more than perhaps they ever meant, or that their understanding would have been.
Right. Right. So to move on to look at hell then,
Yeah.
you know, you have the very often mentioned that hell, when Jesus used it, was actually Gehenna, and that was actually just a trash pit on the outskirts of town.
Yeah.
So does that mean we're going to trash pits on the outskirts of our towns? I mean, what does that mean? Like, how does that relate to us today? And yet somehow that has turned into hell.
It's so interesting because in the Hebrew Bible, that was the valley of Hinnom. And the poor person, so we don't know Hinnom's first name. It was the valley, it was the garden of the son of Hinnom, and that was how it was referred to throughout the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, that became the Greek word Gehenna, and the garden of Hinnom shows up in Joshua. It shows up, some of the other words show up as old as, way back in the beginning of Genesis. The Hebrew word is Sheol or Abaddon. It's just kind of a shadowy place people go after they die. It's just like what happens when people die.
Okay.
Which we're going to talk about in just a minute. But so much of what ended up happening is the translators of the Bible who have translated these words from the Greek and the Hebrew into English, they saw it only through the lens of Greek mythology, which is Hades.
Right.
And so when they saw Gehenna, they just saw Hades, which is the Greek mythology, which is both the god of the dead, but it's also the place where the dead go, and you have to cross the river Styx, and you have to, this whole thing. And that's not at all the mythology or the cosmology of who Jesus would have been as a Jewish man.
Right.
And he lived, died, and his whole life he was Jewish. And so they translated, every time the word Gehenna came up, which I found it really fascinating. This word Gehenna shows up only 11 times in the Gospels.
Okay.
Only 11 times. And it's Gehenna every single time, which is literally the trash pit outside of Jerusalem.
Right.
I learned that the closest place to it today is a town called Silwan. It's a southern slope of Jerusalem. So it's still around today, this actual physical place. So it's not this afterlife sort of thing. It's an actual place. It's like, going to Fountain here in Colorado Springs or something like that,
Yeah. But not that Fountain's bad.
Not the Fountain is
not
a trash
that Fountain's
pit.
bad.
But it's just like, it's a town. It's a place. It's a physical location. So unfortunately.
So just out of curiosity, is it possible that they were just kind of, and I'm just, this is a question, but like we have heard that there are like certain political figures have called countries hellholes.
Oh, yeah.
So they actually exist, but then we're also calling them a hellhole, meaning that it's not a great place to live. Is that what we're kind of thinking that they were saying with Gehenna? Is it more of a slang?
Yeah, it might have been. Yeah, absolutely possible. Yeah.
Just a thought.
It is, yeah. So I think, we're stumbling over issues of translation here, where people, as far back as the King James Version in the 1500s, started translating these words as hell. And then we don't know Greek and Hebrew. So we don't know that these are different concepts altogether in the
Mm.
original languages and in the original time.
Right.
I've had this conversation with people, and I talk about how Jesus doesn't talk about hell, and they're like, "No, he does talk about hell." And I was like, "Jesus talks about Gehenna, not hell."
Mhm.
You
Right,
know?
right,
And it only shows up 11 times in the Gospels. This is
right,
not a huge deal to
right,
Jesus.
right. Wow, not a huge deal to Jesus. Um, and yet it's a really huge deal to us.
It is. It guides so many people's spiritual lives today,
Yes.
unfortunately. The thing that happened, I think, is that, and other people have looked at this, but much later, you've got Dante's Inferno, which is talking about hell and going to hell and circles of hell and all this kind of stuff. It's this whole journey that he makes. So that gets wound up in people's ideas of hell, which is not biblical. It's his own imagination,
Right. Yeah.
You've got Milton's Paradise Lost, which is an epic poem that gets into some of these ideas.
Mm.
And then we have the painter Hieronymus Bosch, who painted these elaborate and terrifying pictures of hell. And all of these things have been read back into the biblical words of hell, Gehenna, or Sheol, which is the Hebrew word. And so we have taken all these experiences of people much later who have written epic poems or painted things, and we assume that that is a biblical understanding of heaven and hell,
Yeah.
and it's really not. And I've
Mhm.
seen some of those paintings like in person, and some of them are huge. And I just worry about what kind of a person that man was, that he could come up with these like horrifying images of what hell is like. It was just
Yes.
super scary,
And
super creepy.
and why would you want that?
Right.
You
What
know what I mean?
tells you
Yeah.
to paint that?
Like we have this great saying, like, I wouldn't even, send my worst enemy to blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
you know? And here's people like painting elaborate scenes of human beings being tortured and in flames and in pain.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying he was hoping for it, but some people do hope for it. And
Yeah.
I think that maybe we should check ourselves a little bit.
Right.
And I know most people don't. And I think that's part of the whole fear-based thing. And like you said, so much of what we do and how we deal with the idea of hell is just trying to get everybody saved, which is what we kind of talked about last time. So then everybody has their ticket to heaven.
Mm-hmm. Until they backslide.
Until they backslide, then you got to get it restamped. It's got to be revalidated. So there are some, believe it or not, there are some alternatives to this binary.
Yes.
And so universalism, I do love this. I do remember talking to somebody about this idea of universalism, and especially Rob Bell's book Love Wins comes out, and he makes this point about, is there a hell? He does kind of all the same stuff that we were kind of talking about, which is where I first learned it and was like, oh my goodness. And I remember saying things like, what concerns me the most is how Rob Bell, and I guess now myself included, will be held accountable if we start to tell people that there is no heaven and hell.
Oh.
And I was like, can't God fix that? I mean, he's pretty big. Like, you know what I mean?
Wow.
Like that, and that was their biggest fear of believing this way, is that
Yeah.
they would be held accountable. And what if there really is a hell and they've told everybody there isn't?
Wow.
And it's like, okay, I mean, I guess I see this. So, but yes, universalism says that God saves everyone eventually.
And that actually shows up even back in the Hebrew Bible in Isaiah,
Oh,
talking about, I'm coming to gather all the nations and tongues together, and that my temple will be a house of prayer for all peoples. I mean, when I learned that, I was like, wow, nobody
Yeah.
ever talked about that when I was growing up.
right, absolutely. So then there's annihilationism, which is a fun word to say, where the wicked just cease to exist.
Oh.
So is that like a backwards rapture? Like they just disappear?
Uh,
The wicked?
yeah, I don't know.
Is it like, is it like Marvel and they're just going to disintegrate
Yeah,
in front of us?
maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's like the opposite though. It's like the good people, this people who are saved are left
Yes.
behind, not the
Yes.
wicked. The
Yes.
wicked just
The wicked just
are just
disappear.
whisked away. Yeah,
Yeah.
whisked away.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a whole scary thing too.
Yeah. And so even in early Christianity, we do know that not everyone agreed on hell because obviously, again, this isn't something that we're going to use the scripture as best we can, but there is no real clear defining thing for most scholars.
Yeah.
I know it's clear defining for certain groups. They think that they know exactly what's going to happen.
Right.
But for the most part, most scholars and thought people and philosophers didn't necessarily understand it. And even Origen believed in universal reconciliation, and not everybody was all about fire and brimstone.
Right.
So,
Yep. And then we have this idea, and we talked about this in our very first episode of the podcast, that some theologians today talk about original blessing rather than this idea on emphasis and sin
right.
and hell, and emphasizing, the idea of heaven and hell really emphasizes punishment rather than reconciliation and love, and drawing all people into God rather than deciding who's in and who's out, and that old, all those jokes about St. Peter at the gates of heaven, and who's
Yeah.
in the book of life and who's not. There are definitely alternatives to these ideas today. And some people just, kind of wash their hands of the whole thing and say, I don't know what,
Yeah.
and I'm just going to live my life and do what I can today, and then whatever happens after I die, and
Right.
so there's all kinds of other ways of looking at what happens after we die. And again, my point is always like, what is that doing to our understanding of how we live our life now? We've talked about how, in previous episodes, about how this idea of heaven is like an escape pod out of
Yes.
this world. And it can lead to people not caring about what's happening here and now, as far as like, what are we doing to the environment, and how are we as human beings affecting climate change and affecting the world around us? Do we have a responsibility to work for justice and peace in this lifetime, or do we just wait for God to whisk us away to some ever after where we can wander the streets of gold and be bored, as you said?
So bored. So bored.
Maybe you get like a golden guitar to play or something like that.
I know, but all that gold, the gold's not going to be precious if it's everywhere.
Well, oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
Right. That's such a...
I'll be bored.
That's so true. I never thought of it that way. That's so true.
Okay. So, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
Where are you feeling now? What do you see as heaven and hell?
Okay. So here's where I land today. I would say, first of all, I do not know.
Fair. Yes.
I have not had a near-death experience. That's a whole kind of genre of things that people have experienced. I've never had that experience. And what they talk about is amazing and remarkable. Where I've come to is that I think a lot of these ideas about heaven and hell are made up by people. I have seen, unfortunately, the very negative consequences of these beliefs in people's lives.
Yeah.
And the kind of spiritual trauma it causes when you can't live up to what the church that you grew up in believes you should be, or who you should be. And when I see the consequences of these beliefs, as you mentioned earlier, I just can't believe that they come from a loving God, that that's not part of it. And so that's what led me into so many of these questions, and like looking at what are the words for hell in the original Greek and Hebrew, and what do they mean, and all that stuff. And when you dig into that, you realize that so much of these beliefs are really modern interpretations that we read back into the Bible. It wasn't there originally. Do I think there's some kind of an afterlife? Yes. I've been exploring a lot with quantum physics and all this kind of stuff, and there's like this whole crazy wild world out there that I'm not going to pretend that I understand it all. However, I am willing to say, okay, yes, there is something beyond our death. What it is, I don't know exactly. Is it this idea of heaven and hell? No, I don't think it's this binary sort of
Right.
thing. I really don't. So what about you? Where are you today?
Oh my goodness. Okay. So you mentioned the near-death experience, or
Yes.
NDEs, as apparently they say.
Yeah.
We have a friend who is very much into them at
Yes.
this moment. And so she keeps sending me videos, which I
Yes.
love.
Uh-huh.
Okay, but here's the weird part. Okay. So in a lot of these videos, the person that dies describes just this overwhelming just feeling of love and acceptance and just peace beyond you can even imagine.
Yeah.
And other people talk about, well, there is no religion there and there is no, right or wrong there. And a lot of that is very attractive to me. And again, I can't say obviously that I know one way or the other, but I will tell you that years and years and years ago, I had a moment where I just out of nowhere was just filled. Now, I don't know if I died, but I don't think I did because
Yeah.
I was still standing.
Right.
But I was completely just filled with this overwhelming love and peace. And I mean, it was like you talk about, they say the perfect love casts out all fear.
Yeah.
I wasn't worried about anything. I was like, oh my God, is this what you're actually like? Because I'm totally in if this is what you're like, God.
Yeah.
And I remember the only problem that I had was like, you're going to leave now, aren't you? Okay, that's fine. Can we just hold on a little bit longer? Because I mean, I remember thinking silly things like, if this is what it is, I'll go right now, right now. I mean, I have kids, little kids, but
Yeah.
none of that, I didn't care.
Yeah.
And so when I hear all of these people that have had these near-death experiences talk about that moment, I was like, oh my goodness, did I feel a fraction of what they're talking about?
Yeah.
And so I recognize that. So I'm a little bit like, okay, I don't know what happened there, but I would tell you I'm in, if that's what heaven is, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
With hell, sometimes I wonder, because some of the things about hell is really just simply a separation from God.
Yeah.
Kind of like sin, it's just a separation from God. And could that be hell? Yeah, hell yes. And
G double
yeah,
hockey sticks.
hell yes. But this idea that I create my own hell, if I'm trying to fix things, if I'm trying to get ahead of God, if I'm just not even talking to God, like, can we create our own hell right here on earth?
Yeah.
And even just looking at like some of the stuff that happens today, you can see that people are pretty good setting up torturous types of scenarios. And so what if that is the hell?
Yeah. That we created
That
ourselves
we've created it
on earth, not
yeah.
in an afterlife, but that we have created it
Yeah.
here and now.
So
Absolutely.
again, I don't know, but I do struggle with the idea that there is a place that God's going to send me, And again, I think what you said is like, if we're so worried about where we're going to go later, how are we living presently? What are we missing presently?
Yeah.
Are we in hell
Absolutely.
right now because we're so worried about being in hell later?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, then you start to get this like, this kind of this fear circle.
Yeah.
Like, I'm so scared of that I'm not going to do anything here and really live because I'm too scared to get out of line because I might go there, but yet I'm also not experiencing the fullness of everything that this life can give me.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's just kind of a hamster in a wheel, it feels like. So,
well, and so much of this idea of heaven and hell is really about reinforcing a religion of fear rather
Yes.
than a religion of love and acceptance and peace. And
Right.
that's such a, to me, that was also a big disconnect, is like, that doesn't sound like the Jesus that I know and that I learned about. This doesn't sound like, why would Jesus do that, you know?
Exactly.
And Jesus himself never took up arms against anyone. It's a real disconnect to me. And is it a true belief if it only comes from fear? Are you able to really
Yes.
give yourself to God if it's only out of a sense of fear? I think that's a very challenging way to come to a religious belief. And I
Yeah.
think it's a sad and it's a very hard place to be.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for tuning in. Up next, will the rejects keep, rethink, or reject today's topic? Stay with us.
Do you keep, rethink, or reject the idea? Let's start with hell. Keep, reject, rethink the idea of hell. Where do you come down on that?
Oh my good. Okay, so I feel like it's multi-layered.
Mm.
I definitely reject the Dante's Inferno type of hell, but I definitely want to rethink this place that we can put ourselves in that causes us pain, whether we want to call that hell or not.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely want to rethink that.
Yeah.
What about you?
I reject the idea of a hell and an afterlife, that there's an afterlife of
Okay.
hell. Like
Yeah.
that there's this thing where you go either to the left or to the right. You know what I mean? It's the sheep or the goats, you
Right,
know?
right.
Yeah, I definitely reject that. And I agree. I do think metaphorically we can be in a hell of our own making or of our own human making in this
Yeah.
lifetime. And I'm much less willing to speculate about the afterlife, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. And what about heaven? How are you feeling about that?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't think it would be the language I would use today.
Yeah, I like that, the language, because I think that's what it kind of comes down to is, I don't even know if heaven is the right word.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. When people talk about these near-death experiences, there's this sense of unification that they have, that they're part of everything.
Yeah.
And so to me, when you hear about these experiences of near-death experiences and they talk about them, this idea of separating people out into the good and the bad, the good and the evil, it doesn't sound anything like what their experiences are, because it sounds
Right.
like they're unified into this whole, into this
Mm-hmm.
all-consuming love and peace. And so I don't know, it's just really interesting. And who knows? I don't know. Like I said, I don't know. I have not had one of those experiences. And so I can't really say. And I'm willing to take my chances about hell. It's okay.
Yeah.
I take
Yeah.
full responsibility for my eternal salvation.
Yes. Me too. Yes.
Yeah.
That's how we roll. Well, there you have it. We have solved all the problems of the world again in less than an hour.
Yes, there we go.
Join us again next time on Religious Rejects, and we're going to talk about something even more fun, the rapture.
Yeah.
And
It's kind of a subset of this
it
idea
is a
of heaven.
subset. Yeah, there's a lot of overlap, so it's
Yeah.
going to be fun.
Yeah. And so we'd love to hear what you think about all of this. What are you thinking about heaven and hell? Email us at religiousrejects.com. You can find us on social media. Join the conversation with us, and we will see you next time. I'm Alicia.
And I'm Christine.
See you next
Bye.
time. Bye-bye.